Since the beginning of time, war has been known as no place for women. Dickey Chapelle was never one to be told no, especially if it was because of her gender. Dickey Chapelle's tragic death in Vietnam made her the first female war correspondent killed in action, but her courage and impact serves as a triumphant gateway for women in military journalism. Not only did Chapelle change who could report, but she also revolutionized how information was obtained. Instead of sitting back at correspondent headquarters, Chapelle was up on the front lines, photographing and writing about the battles. Chapelle wrote the articles that were often deemed as articles that represented what was going on most truthfully.
Georgette Louise Meyer, better known as Dickey Chapelle, was born on March 14, 1918. Chapelle always showed extreme patriotism. When she was in elementary school, Chapelle would stop and salute the American flag in the morning, a routine not common for a child of that age. At the age of 14, Chapelle sold her first article to U.S. Air Service magazine. The article was named Why We Want to Fly, the we meaning woman. Chapelle later enrolled at MIT. In 1942, Chapelle went off to Panama with her husband Tony. Tony was a World War I veteran who was going to Panama to be a photographer. They had been married 2 years prior, so Dickey would put in an application for a press credential to be with Tony in Panama. Eventually, her husband was put on an overseas assignment. Because of this, Chapelle went to New York for 2 years, from 1943 to 1944. Waiting for an assignment, while there in New York she wrote 8 books, 2 of which, Needed Women in Government Service and Girls at Work in Aviation, promoted women to help out around the military and government. In 1944, Tony returned, and for a while, they were together. In 1945, Dickey got an offer from Fawcett Publications for an assignment to cover the nurses on the Pacific Front in World War II. Tony pushed for her not going, and told her that 3 photojournalists that he had trained were killed in battle, and another 7 were wounded. But getting an offer like this, Dickey could not say no. She flew over to California in the next few months to document the training process of the U.S. nurses. In January of 1945, she was the first female photographer to be accredited to the United States Navy.
Her next assignment was to write about the hospital boat, the USS Samaritan. The boat was stationed in Guam, so before they could go, she had a little bit of time to stay in Guam. While in Guam, she was able to meet Navy soldiers, nurses, and other correspondents. In February, the USS Samaritan departed for Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific Theater. She documented nurses taking care of wounded soldiers and the sailors of the boats. Eventually, she was granted permission to go on the island to photograph an on-land marine hospital. She was able to photograph nurses in the scene and soldiers who gave up so much for their country and their freedom. Her next stop was the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. She was assigned to cover the use of blood donation aboard the ship the USS Relief. But 2 days after working on this topic, she decided to get a little more. Even though she was told specifically not to go on shore by H.B. Miller, head of public relations of the Pacific Fleet, she was going to find a way on shore, onto a landing boat. When she arrived, Major General Lemuel C. Shepard was surprised when he saw her, for she was a woman who was not a nurse but in battle. Her excuse was that the documentation of onshore blood use would convince more Americans to donate blood. When H.B. Miller found out she would deliberately disobeyed orders and went on shore, he ordered her under arrest on a Navy ship. Because of this, Dickey would lose her accreditation to the Navy, which meant that she wouldn't be taking any more photographs or writing more articles on World War II. It would be almost 10 years before she was able to earn her accreditation back. Chapelle had pushed past where society deemed it was safe for her to go. She went to the front line. Reporters, especially female reporters, almost never journeyed to the front lines because of the danger, instead reporting on what the military was telling them. The regular people wanted to hear what other regular people had seen and thought about the front lines in the battle of a war. This being her first war, she proved herself as a combat photojournalist. In 1958, Chapelle was taking a break from covering wars. She was in New York and was thinking over her time in Lebanon and the two other revolutions she had covered recently. I did, but not half so much as I minded the larger truths about the revolutions had failed. Hungary had fallen to the tanks. Brothers still fought brother in Algeria. Rioting continued in Lebanon. But men continued to hope and fight for a better world, wrote Dickey Chapelle. After she heard about riots in Cuba, she soon went to interview Cuban rebels. After going to an underground rebel base in Miami, she flew to Havana, Cuba. She was able to get past the police guarding the city by saying that she was a photographer. Now for the harder task of getting through the city proper. She pretended to be running from the authorities because they didn't want Marine wives at the base. She had a picture of a Marine man who she said she was engaged to. She was let in the city, and now she could begin her trek to meet Castro.
She was taken by jeep across a former battle zone to a city. In the city, the rebels and the police were at a ceasefire. When the fighting began again, they had to evacuate in a jeep, which crashed on the way out. Chapelle was luckily only slightly injured, while many others suffered more serious injuries. Dickey talked with Castro a few times, staying at his headquarters and becoming friends with some of his troops. Chapelle had once again wandered into a place not common for a female to be found. Chapelle sometimes doubted her job choice. She always felt a duty to report what was going on. That duty was what brought her back to rebellions, conflicts, and wars time and time again. In 1961, Dickey got an assignment from the Reader's Digest to cover U.S. advisors in Vietnam. This was still in the early parts of the war, so she returned in 1962 to the United States to promote her book, What's a Woman Doing Here? Though the book was only a modest seller, she was awarded the Overseas Press Club George Polk Award for her journalism. Later in 1962, she returned to Vietnam covering for National Geographic. Her article, Helicopter War Over Vietnam, was the cover for National Geographic's 1962 November articles. A picture from that article of Nelson West, a United States advisor with Vietnamese soldiers, won an award in the following year. Her next return to Vietnam was in 1964 for National Geographic to document the U.S. advisors in the Navy of Vietnam. In 1965, she returned to the war for one last time.
She was covering for the National Observer and a group of Marines who were operating a clear and destroy mission called Black Ferret. There were other photographers and journalists there, which included Henry Hewitt, a French photographer covering for the Associated Press. On November 4th, 1965, near the Song Tai Bong River, a young Marine activates a tripwire, setting off a grenade. The grenade caused 5 Marines and a Navy officer to be injured and shrapnel to cut through Chapelle's carotid artery. Lieutenant John McNamara gave Dickey her last rites, and Henry Hewitt captured it. This image still haunts many about the terror of the war in Vietnam. General Wallace M. Greene, Jr. said this to the Marine Corps. All U.S. Marines, the world over, mourn the death of Dickey Chapelle, who died of wounds received while covering combat operations by Marines in South Vietnam. She was not only a skilled, dedicated newspaperwoman, but she was also an exemplary patriot, whose great love for her country was an inspiration to all who knew her and worked with her. She was one of us, and we will miss her. Chapelle would die a couple hours later in a Marine helicopter on her way to a hospital.
Even though Chapelle's career was shortened by her death in Vietnam, she was able to capture tragedies and triumphs of war. She was never stopped by the barriers of her gender, or if she was, she found a way through that barrier. She was able to change the world with the power of her camera and her ability to push through any tasks she was met with. Chapelle's death brought attention to her life, and soon after there were more female journalists in other wars around the globe. Catherine Leroy and Kate Webb, who photographed and wrote about Vietnam almost directly after the death of Chapelle. Both of them seemingly drew inspiration from Chapelle. Jackie Spinner, a reporter on Afghanistan for the Washington Post. Chapelle revolutionized reporting for the reporters to come and opened a great wide window for the females who wanted to report.